is tenfold, then mine is 10 times tenfold. So, and he talks about his two wives, and it gives this implication that he has enslaved his wives. So he's already messed it up, right? So, what I'm going to do is this is going to be a little bit different. So, I'm going to read chapter 2, verses 1 through 12, and then I'm going to give you some context surrounding the passage, and then we're going to reread it with a few points of emphasis. So, look with me in John chapter 2, verse 1. It says this: On the third day, there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus also was invited to the wedding with his disciples. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now there were 6 stone water jars there for Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water." And they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast." So they took it. When the master of the feast tasted the water now become wine, and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn out the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and when people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now." This is the first of his signs Jesus did at Cana in Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there for a few days. Okay, so we obviously know that now God has ordained marriage. God is the creator of marriage. Okay, so now I want you to understand that God has a high value of marriage. If God is the creator of something, he should be the one to limit the value of it, right? It's not our job to put a value on marriage. So we can't change the rules about marriage if we didn't create it, right? That means that whenever God says marriage is between one man and one woman, we say amen. Okay? So God has a high value of marriage. Here's how I can show you. Marriage, as Paul says in Ephesians chapter 5, is a picture of the gospel. That is, it's a picture of God's faithful love to us. When we love our spouse the way that we should, we are reflecting the grace and the mercies of God. Despite the hurt, we offer forgiveness, right? Despite the pain, we offer that forgiveness, we offer that love. God uses it to show as a picture, oftentimes through the prophets, of his faithfulness to, particularly in the Old Testament, to Israel, but to all peoples. But he also uses it to show the unfaithfulness of Israel. Israel is, in the Old Testament, considered his bride. If you read the prophet Hosea, actually, God tells Hosea, "Go and marry a woman who is loved by another man." And then she leaves him, and then God says, "Go find her and buy her back and bring her home and love her." So the picture there is God as the faithful husband who still loves his unfaithful spouse. That's a picture of God's mercy. So God has a high value of marriage. Now, let me give you some understanding to what the wedding ceremony or the wedding celebration would have looked like in the culture that which Jesus lived in. So, obviously, the marriage back then was an arranged marriage. So what the process would look like is the groom's parents, when it came time for preparation for the wedding, when the son became of a certain age to marry, the parents would look for a suitable bride for him. So the groom's parents would go and meet with the bride's parents. They would come to some sort of agreement, and the groom's parents would pay a quote-unquote down payment to start the betrothal period, so that they came to this agreement. So now the bride and the groom are now in a contract together. It was breakable, but by law they were considered to be married. That starts the betrothal process. So they are now married. Now, the difference is, because when we see betrothed in the Bible, like whenever it says that Mary and Joseph were betrothed to each other, we typically think of that as what? Being engaged. Now, it's similar to it in the fact that they're not technically married because they're not technically living together, right? The problem, or the idea is that they're not living together. In fact, they basically have no contact with each other. The bride or the soon-to-be bride would go and stay at home to remain pure and to make sure that she was prepared to be the fitting wife that she was supposed to be. The groom, what he would do was he would go and he would leave so that they didn't have any contact with each other. And this year-long betrothal period, he would go and he would build his house for him and his wife and future family to live in. Now, where was the house? The house was always built upon his parents' house. So now, when you read in John chapter 14, when Jesus says that in my Father's house are many mansions, and if it were not so, would I have told you, and I go to prepare a place for you, he's saying, I am betrothed to you. I am leaving you to go and build the house, and one day I'm going to come back. So whenever the betrothal period ended, the groom would be done building the house. He would make sure he was all dressed up in his wedding clothing, garments, and then he would go to his bride's parents' house. The bride's parents would give his bride to him, and they would take this walk from her house to his parents' house. And there would be a huge parade. Family and friends would be there. They would be dancing, and they would be singing. They would be playing music all the way from that walk from her parents' house to his parents' house. And then whenever they got to his parents' house, they had the wedding ceremony and the wedding celebration. Now, how long did the wedding celebration last? 7 days is a long time, okay? After a while, maybe you guys know this, but after a while, you kind of get tired of people being around you, right? Sometimes you're like, I just need some space. Maybe it's not you, maybe it's just me, but sometimes I just like my space, right? So 7 days of a wedding ceremony. They would be together. They would have it at his parents' house, and it was a joyous thing. It wasn't just a select few people that would be there, by the way. Usually the whole village would be at this thing. It was a huge thing. So the whole Jewish culture valued marriage in such a way that they would celebrate for 7 days. Think about it. Think about these people who depended upon like things like farming or certain jobs where you couldn't really leave, but they would stop for 7 days, maybe find a hired servant or something. They would go to this and they would celebrate. It was considered a joyful thing, and they were there to support in the community. Okay? So now that we have that, let's go back and let's reread this. So as I reread this, what I want you to do, what I encourage you to do, is highlight or underline some key details that John puts in here, because they are important now that you have a little bit of this understanding. Okay? Take a deep breath here. Verse 1. On the third day, there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus also was invited to the wedding with his disciples. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now there were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water," and they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast." So they took it. When the master of the feast tasted the water now become wine and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and when people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now." This, the first of his signs, Jesus did at Cana in Galilee and manifested his glory. His disciples believed in him. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there for a few days. Okay, so now, observations or key things that you thought were important from particularly verses 1 through 5. Anything stick out to anybody? The third day, okay, that's a key. That's, well, it depends on how it's translated. There's 2 views on that, but yeah, third day, that's important. Anybody else? 6 stone water jars, okay. So in verse 6, what about verses 1 through 5? My hour has not yet come. That's a really important one. There's 2 more in this passage that I have that stuck out to me. Do whatever he tells you. Okay, that I didn't have that one, but that is important because that shows Mary's faith. What is the context? There was a wedding. That's important to know. And then the other one is in verse 3. What's the problem? The wine ran out. Okay? So verses 1 through 5, it kind of lays out in three parts here. So the first part is the scenario. Verses 1 through 5 is the scenario. So we have these observations. So let's break down a few of these things. So the third day. So there's two ways to view this. Most scholars agree with the second one. The first view, though, is that it's the third day of the wedding. Now, that's not necessarily because of the way that you read it in the Greek. That doesn't make the most sense. What makes the most sense is the second one, in which it would be on the third day after the end of chapter 1. The end of chapter 1, Jesus calls Philip and Nathanael to be his disciples. So then 2 days later, on the third day of this happening, then they get to the wedding ceremony. And here's why this makes sense, because if you read a little bit further, it says that Jesus and his disciples were invited to this. Okay, well, who are his disciples so far? Well, Philip and Nathanael were some of them. So John is likely talking about them. Though it could have been John and Andrew as well, and Peter. So we have a few speculations there, but it's likely either the first or the second day of this wedding ceremony or this wedding feast. Okay? Why is that important? How long does it last? 7 days. So you're just getting started, right? The party just got started. Imagine if you were having a huge party and everyone in the big city of Ellerby showed up to your house, and within the first couple hours, so you have a 12-hour long party, in the first 2 hours, you're out of food, you're out of drinks. Problem, right? It's a little bit different than that, and I'll explain. Okay? So we're probably 2 days into this, the wedding. Okay, so the second thing to see here is that Jesus is at the wedding. Is that symbolic of something? Anybody think there's any symbolism in the fact that it says that Jesus was invited to the wedding? Do you think it's pretty good to have Jesus invited to your wedding? Yeah. What about Jesus invited into your marriage? That's really good. You know, one key thing that our premarital counselor for Nikki and I, when we were getting ready to get married, was he said people put so much of a priority on the wedding day, and they should, and it's a great celebration. But there's so much planning, so much preparation, so much money that's poured into one day, and nobody takes the time to prep for the rest of your lives. It's so important that we just look at this application here really quick and say that we should invite Jesus to be at the center of our marriages, the center of the wedding ceremony. Because when we put Christ at the center of our marriage, he will honor that. Always honor that. So it's symbolic there, but also, isn't it so cool that Jesus, the one who ordained marriage, who created marriage, is there celebrating it with humanity? Isn't that pretty cool? He's there with them in joyful celebration. This was a joyous time. They were key on community. So whenever there was somebody who got married, they celebrated, and they celebrated big time. But whenever there was somebody who died, they wept, and they wept big time. The reason that they would weep, culturally speaking, they would have wept loudly at their funeral service. They did that actually out of respect for the person who died and their family. So they were key on community. So the fact that Jesus was there should tell you that Jesus was approving of the marriage. Jesus was approving of it. Jesus has a high view of marriage because he's the one who created it. So Jesus is here at the wedding. Now here's the problem. They're out of wine. Why is this a problem? On the whole family. It looks really bad on the family. Which family? Not the wives, the grooms, okay? So think of the stark contrast between the weddings of Jesus' day and the weddings of our day. In the wedding of our day, who is the focus more on, the bride or the groom? The bride. In Jesus' day, it would have been more on the groom. So when we talk about like finances, who traditionally in our culture pays for the wedding? The bride's family, right? They pay for it. Everything would have actually been on the groom because they had it at their house. They would have supplied all the supplies. They would have made sure that it was something that was well kept for 7 days, that they had enough food, they had enough um, wine, they had enough drink for everyone to have plenty, for plenty to go around for everyone. It would have been a shameful thing. In fact, it would have been so shameful that the bride's parents could have taken the groom's parents to court over it because it would have been considered not keeping up your end of the bargain. We've done our part. We provided you our daughter, and you have brought shame upon my daughter's marriage and our whole family because you have not supplied enough for it. So this was a shameful thing. And it's also shameful because it's to the bride and the groom, it's ruining their reputation starting off in their marriage. For the rest of their lives, their marriage is going to be known as the marriage that couldn't supply for everyone. It was shameful. So there is a heavy amount of shame that's about to be brought onto the bride and the groom and then the groom's family. So I want to ask a question. Could Jesus have been related to the groom? Think about it. Why do you think? Yes, Mary is the key here. So if Mary is in on this, right. And why did Mary go to Jesus? She had concern because that's her family, right? So it makes sense. So we don't know who the bride and the groom are, but we have a pretty good insight based on those two things that Jesus was related to the groom. So that's just an interesting note. I'll let you take that for what it is. But I want to ask you a question here. Why does Jesus refer to Mary, his mom, as woman? If you look in verse 4, it was respect. It would have been to you and I like saying ma'am. Okay, it wouldn't have been a degrading thing. He wasn't like, woman, what are you doing? He wasn't upset with her, okay? That's not, so don't read it like that, okay? So if someone says he had no value of women by the way he addressed his mom, that's just culturally doesn't make sense, okay? So he was saying, ma'am, what does this mean for you and for me? Like, what, I'm here to celebrate. What does this have concern with me? So I want to key in on the next part here because his answer is, my hour has not yet come. What does it mean when he says, my hour has not yet come? For public miracles, what did you say, Mr. Steve? A revelation of the Christ. Any other thoughts on what my hour could also mean?
What you said earlier about tying it all together to bride and groom, if his hour has not come, I mean, this is not, like that's not ready for all that to happen, as far as him being revealed as the groom.
Okay. Okay, so we're on to something here. So what sets up? Yes. Now what sets that up? What sets him up as the faithful groom who is our Savior? Not, and I think you guys are right to an extent too, to be titled as Messiah. But what did he have to publicly? He had to publicly declare himself to be Messiah, and then what was the result of that? His crucifixion. So when and John several times refers to Jesus stating, "My hour has not yet come," or whenever it's time for his hour to come, he says, "My hour has now come," and he's talking about the crucifixion. So every time you see, whenever Jesus is referencing "my hour," he's making a direct reference to his crucifixion. So whenever he is preparing that, you can even say, "Yeah, my hour to prepare for my wedding," as in Revelation 19, the marriage supper of the Lamb. He's referring to his crucifixion and resurrection to bring salvation. So I guess the question now is, well, why isn't he ready to reveal himself? I mean, he could have, he's 30 years old. He could have revealed himself as Messiah when he was 12, teaching in the temple. He could have revealed himself as Messiah at 28. He could have revealed himself as Messiah 10 years down the road. Why did he do it when he did it? Basic answer. Say that one more time. Okay. Yep. He knows he has to be rejected. He understood the scriptures. What's the most basic answer we can give? It was in his timing. He knew the Father's will. He was trusting in the Father's will. That's another good application for you and for me. We trust in God's timing because his will and his timing is perfect for us. So he was not ready to reveal himself until this point because it was not yet the Father's will for his time. It was also going to be a sign of proof of him as the Son of God. Hence, this is why John places this in here. Now, here is something interesting for you and for me to see here. Look at Mary's response to all this. The end of verse 5. Do whatever he tells you. I know Ms. Ashley pointed that out just a minute ago. That's Mary's faith. Think of Mary being the mother of the Son of God. If you read in Luke's account, after she explains to Luke the entirety of the birth narrative, how it was told to her by the angel Gabriel, how the birth happened, how the shepherds showed up, and we talked about that several weeks ago, how that referred to him as the Passover lamb, and then later on how the wise men showed up to him. And it says at the end of that chapter, in Luke chapter 2, Mary pondered these things in her heart. Mary knew exactly who Jesus was. So here's another application for you and for me. Mary saw a problem and she went straight to Jesus, who she knew who Jesus was. She went straight to Jesus because she knew there's a problem and he's the only one who can truly fix it. That's important. It's really important that she understood who he was. Can you imagine raising the Son of God? Have you ever felt inadequate as a parent? Yeah. Imagine being like, Jesus, son, can you forgive me? I mean, you didn't do anything wrong, I did, right? That would be a tough thing that she would have gone through, right? She knew exactly who Jesus was. That's why she says, do whatever he tells you to do. All right, verses 6 through 8 set up the second part here. So first we had the scenario, now we have the solution. The solution. So now, what key details do we have here? I know Jackson said a minute ago the 6 stone water jars, which were for what purpose? The purification. Now, he says that for the Gentile audience, because if you were a Jew reading this, you would have known what the 6 stone water jars were there for. You wouldn't have even had to say six stone water jars. You could just said the jars for purification. Okay? So there's how many? 6. Remember, numbers are important. Okay, so we're going to come back to the 6 in just a second. And remember their purpose for purification. And it tells you how big they are. So a piece, they're 20 or 30 gallons. So we're talking, unless I'm bad on my math, it's 120 to 180 gallons. A lot of water. Okay? Any other important details? To the brim. That's another really important thing. I'll get to that in just a minute. Verse 9, there's an important phrase listed there. The servants did know. They were eyewitnesses to it. There's something else there. Something's changed. The water now become wine. The water now become wine. Verse 10. There's an adjective used to describe the wine. Choice or good. And then the last part in verse 10. Jesus did this and it manifested or revealed his glory. And then as a result, another thing, his disciples believed in him. Those are important details. So let's break these things down. So the solution here, there are 6 stone water jars. Now, why are there 6? What does 6 represent? Not 6 tribes, imperfection, incompleteness. That's key. You're going to want to remember that because that's going to bring something full circle here for us. So there are 6 jars here that are specified for the purpose of the Jewish rite of purification. Turn to Mark chapter 7 with me really quick. Mark chapter 7. If you, just by way of reminder, Mark writes his gospel to the Romans. So he gives an important detail to the Romans about Jewish rites of purification that kind of explain why the Jews have these stone water jars here. Mark chapter 7, verses 3 and 4, he explains. It says, "For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands properly, holding to the tradition of the elders. And when they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And there are many other traditions that they observe, such as the washing of cups and pots and copper vessels and dining couches." So, what he's explaining to his Roman audience who doesn't know anything about Jewish customs and Jewish rites of purification, he explains to them this is what it's for. It's for their hand washing for their uncleanliness, and it's for their washing of specific dishes, of steel and metal pots and silverware and cups. They would use those things for. And so there are 6 of them. They're large. Why are they large? Well, it's kind of giving you this understanding that there's a lot of people at this wedding. Okay? So you have to think there's a lot of water. And what was the detail about these stone jars? They were filled to the brim. So they're incomplete. It says this purification wasn't in the law. It's not in the Torah. So it wasn't a God-given law for purification. This was actually something that came about through the Talmud, which happened during the time of the Babylonian captivity. So this would have happened probably 500 years, 600 years before Christ. This came about. And so it had become a customary tradition that the Jews followed, that they believed was a ceremonial cleansing for them to follow. In fact, Jesus' question about this, why aren't your disciples washing their hands properly before they eat? Don't they know that they're supposed to do that? And Jesus says it's not what you put into the body that corrupts you. It's what comes out of you that shows your corruption. Mic drop. Okay? So they're large stone jars holding up to 180 gallons, but the important detail is that they're filled to the brim. Why is it important that John writes that these are filled to the brim? Correct. No tricks. There's no magic going on here. Okay, let me give you a little bit of insight. There were some tricksters or magicians who tried to turn water to a reddish colored substance back in the Old Testament. Anybody know who that was? Jambres. Yep, very good. The 2 sorcerers at Pharaoh's court. So after Moses turned water to wine, which, hey, there's a connection here because Moses' first public miracle was also similar to Jesus' first public miracle. Now, they do the same thing in a sense, right? So what's Jesus doing? It's filled to the brim. There's no tricks here. He's not adding anything, right? How did God create? He created ex nihilo. He created out of nothing. How did Jesus change the physical attributes from water to wine? He didn't add something to it. He changed it ex nihilo. He changed it out of nothing. That's important. That is a sign of only God. That is something only God could do. Now, the task is the servants have to take the wine to the banquet master so that he could taste it. That was part of his responsibility. He was supposed to taste everything, whether it be wine or food, and then they were supposed to serve it. So the banquet master was over the whole feast, over the whole celebration. He was basically the wedding coordinator. So he was supposed to make sure that the food tastes good, the wine tastes good, and that there's nothing going wrong. And if there was something that was about to go wrong, you alert the banquet master. By the way, when something started to go wrong, did they alert the banquet master first? No, they alerted the person who's really in charge, right? So when they go to the banquet master, The banquet master tries the wine, though he didn't know what was going on, but the servants knew because they saw it. They are thinking, he did this out of nothing, right? He turned it straight from water to wine, no tricks, no nothing. I can't explain it, but he did. They go, and what's the banquet master's reaction? He says, "You're supposed to save or use the best first, and then save the cheap wine for later. Whenever everyone's full of wine and their taste buds have just become so acclimated to the wine, why did you save the best wine for now?" So not only did Jesus bless this couple, but he blessed them in abundance. Remember, God honors marriages of those who seek him, of those whom have invited Jesus into the wedding and into the marriage. So Jesus has blessed it in abundance. But let's get back to this. Why six? Why 6 stone jars? The incompletion. So here's what happens. Jesus was showing that the rituals of man are incomplete and insufficient. Number 6, right? We are insufficient to save and purify ourselves. He came to complete our insufficiencies. The reason why there's 6 stone jars was there was a picture that Jesus was going to come and make it 7, make it complete. You can always ask the question, whenever you see the number, why 6? Why not 10? Why not 12? Why not 50? There's 6 for a reason. John has given you a specific understanding. It's incomplete. Your man-made rituals are incomplete. The application for you and for me is there is nothing I can do on my own to save myself. That's where Christ comes in. That's where the gospel comes in. Because I can't save myself. He came to bring us a sufficiency. It could have been. It just depended upon how many people were there. So that's one of the things that we would say. Not only are the words of God here divinely inspired, but the events are. Like the timing of Jesus being at this wedding and them coincidentally running out of wine and having coincidentally 6 jars, right? It's not coincidence. We know that that was divinely inspired, right? Good point. The third thing here is the satisfaction. So now the new wine is brought to the master of the feast, and the water has now become wine. I explained to you the similarities that we have between Moses turning the water to blood, and Jesus turning the water to wine. But there's some understanding here of why the good wine was typically served first. The reason is when they would start to run low, what they would do is they would actually dilute the wine into these jars of water to be able to give a somewhat taste of wine, but the people had already had their fill of wine, so it wasn't as big of a deal. So Jesus taking the water and purely making it wine he was actually giving a huge improper blessing. There's also meaning to wine. Wine has a symbolic meaning to it. Wine represents joy. Psalm 104, verse 15. Let us drink of the joy of God's wine cup. It is a representation of joy. David says in Psalm 16:11 that you reveal the paths of life to me. In your presence there is a fullness of joy, and at your right hand are eternal pleasures forevermore. So the idea of this being new wine as good wine shows that God in his presence gives us an abundance of joy. That there's a bountiful amount of joy added to our lives. And then there is a removal of shame. See, here's the good thing. When Jesus came and he did what he did, he removed the shame from the groom, from the bride, and from the groom's family. Just like that, when we place our trust in him, he removes the guilt, he removes the sin, he removes the shame from us, and he places his goodness, his righteousness, his grace upon us. See, what happened was The shame, the shameful news, instead of being taken to the banquet master, instead of being taken to the groom to startle his joyful celebration, it was taken to Jesus. The shame was placed upon Jesus. Just like that is whenever the shame of the cross, the shame of our sins was placed upon Jesus, so that we don't receive the shame, we don't receive the sufferings. Isaiah 53:3 says that Jesus is a man of sorrows, acquainted with our grief. We esteemed him not, but he was stricken for our sorrows. And then this is a huge understanding here. He manifested his glory. He reveals his glory. This is the first sign that is revealed for you and for me to see that Jesus truly is the Son of God. Anytime that you come across someone who is a skeptic about Christianity, a skeptic about Jesus actually being God, what I would recommend you tell them is read through the Gospel of John with no bias. Read through it and let them decide for themselves who Jesus really is. You read this, and you and I should automatically go back to Exodus 7 when God turns water to wine or water to blood. The Nile River turns to blood. And eventually what happens is in the 10 plagues that go on, eventually these two magi, these two sorcerers of Pharaoh, eventually they can't perform the signs and these wonders that God is performing. They can't mimic them. So they say, this is truly the hand of God. Like there's nothing we can do here. By the time they get to the gnats, and there's gnats everywhere swarming in Egypt, they're like, I got nothing for you, Pharaoh. Like, I'm out. I'm out of tricks. This is clearly the hand of God. Like, you better stop. And obviously, Pharaoh didn't. But clearly, we see that just like God manifests his glory in Egypt, he's now manifesting it here. This is a sign of Jesus' divine nature. And as a result, the disciples truly believed because they knew, surely this is God, Emmanuel, God with us. So let me give you a few points of application here. First of all, as I said earlier, put Jesus at the center of your marriage. He will bless it. Jesus should be at the center of your marriage. Marriage is difficult. She could probably attest to that. Marriage is difficult, right? To have a lifelong covenant with somebody. By the way, marriage is not a contract, it's a covenant, and it is stated by God. God is the one who ordains it. So if God's the creator of it, we should always seek to love our spouses like Christ loves us. Men, that's the exact calling that God places on us. Ephesians chapter 5, husbands are to love their wives as Christ loved the church. How did Christ love the church? He gave himself up for her. We have to deny our wants, our rights from ourselves, and we have to be willing to give whatever it takes for our spouses, for our wives. That's the calling of a husband. Wives, you are called to honor your husband. You are called to serve your husband. You are called to submit to your husband as he submits to Christ. That's what a Christ-centered marriage should look like. Number 2, go to him for your needs. He's the only one who can satisfy them. Go to Jesus for your needs. He's the only one who can satisfy them. Let me also state this. There's a difference between going to God for your petitions, when you are making petitions and requests before God, and when you are going to a genie for a wish. There's a huge difference. Oftentimes, when people go to God, they go to God thinking he's just this genie who's just going to grant them their wish if they just say the right words, that they can get it right. God is not a genie. Sometimes we often think God does not answer our prayers. God always answers our prayers. Sometimes we think that because he doesn't answer them the way that we want him to, right? What are God's answers to our prayers? Yes, no, and not yet, right? And sometimes when it's the no or not yet, you look back and you're like, God, thank you, because you knew better than I did, right? He always answers our prayers. He always hears us, and he knows better than we do. Go to him for your needs. Number 3, dwell on God's grace. You can't save yourself. Dwell on God's grace. You can't save yourself. The moment that you forget the grace of God, you fall into one of two categories. One, you become self-righteous like the Pharisees and you think you earned your salvation. Or two, you become the unrighteous Gentile who lives however he wants to live and just thinks that God is going to approve of you no matter what. That salvation is just simply a get out of hell free card, and you go and you live the way you want to live, and God will just approve that no matter what. Both are wrong. God doesn't save you just from sin, God saves you to himself. We are not free to sin, we're free from sin. There's a huge difference. Any closing thoughts, comments, questions? Anything maybe that stuck out to you I didn't state? We didn't cover? Anybody see this passage in a different sense? Anybody now for the first time seeing the six stone water jars?
I'll say something.
Go ahead.
I was sitting there thinking, like you said, what he did for a reason for the servants. The banquet master had no idea, like, what had happened. And when I first had, like, read this, I'm thinking, well, why didn't he just, like, give them wine? Give them wine like that. But there was a reason why he did what they did, so the servants could witness the transition.
Yeah.
And sometimes we might think, well, why doesn't God just do it? But there's things sometimes that he's doing that we can't see or understand. And it just, I don't know.
That's a good point. Yeah. Yeah, the witness part of it. Yep. Go and be a witness and a testimony of what God's done in your life. Amen. Good point.
In the past, when I read it, I always thought, Jesus said, well, might as well get started now and turn the water into wine, so we might as well get the shoulder up.
Yeah. I guess so. Jackson?
No, I do wonder if it's the start of the wedding ceremony and he just created all of this wine. Why did he leave? It says that he went to Capernaum for a few days.
Well, it's not necessarily implying that he left from the ceremony, because that would have been a dishonoring thing to the family to have left early. I think it's implying that after the ceremony was over, he left.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's a different book. Mine says after this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, see, I reckon I just interpreted this as the changing of the water.
Yeah. So it would mean that this would be after the ceremony. Yep. Any other questions or observations?